Thank you so much for joining us today. We are pleased to have you. On behalf of the Assembly of Canonical Orthodox Bishops and Bread for the World, we welcome you to this timely discussion about homelessness and hunger, a faith-based response. We begin in the very beginning. For many of us, of course, that's the Old Testament. And in the Old Testament, we know there are many stories of people moving from place to place and trying to find a home or trying to create a home. The Old Testament is about the promised land and finding that space and place where God's people will be welcome. But even in the New Testament, we see the same theme. We remember, especially the gospel according to St. Luke, the second chapter, the seventh verse. And she brought forth her firstborn son and wrapped him in swaddling clothes and laid him in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn. Well, today, there's no room in the inn for approximately 110 million refugees today. No room in the inn for those who are migrating from place to place because of conflict, war, and yes, climate, and also economic deprivation. No room in the inn for those south of the U.S. borders who try to come to the United States for refuge and sanctuary. Those who do make it across and are sent to urban centers in our country. This on top of domestic concerns around the movement of peoples not finding a home or finding homes that are not agreeable with lives of human dignity. This has been perpetually the story of any place in the world, including the United States. But alas, there is good news. The churches, the faith community, and many others of goodwill have said no to shutting out those who rightfully need a place to raise their families and to love one another. Good news. That's what we bring today. We are very pleased that the Assembly of the Canonical Orthodox Bishops has created a new resource to help us further understand what our response can be. And yes, Bread for the World, also calling for policies that will help us to support those who are affected by hunger and homelessness. We know the scriptures only too well in Matthew about feeding the hungry, visiting the sick, visiting those who are imprisoned. The mandate is clear. Hunger and homelessness go together. And so, together, in this moment of partnership, we bring to you a new resource. We bring to you experts who are coming from the faith community to offer faith responses relative to the challenges that we still have today. You are welcome. We invite you to hear closely what our speakers have to say, and more than this, to take these stories, take this knowledge, and apply it to the context in which you find yourself. Now it is my great joy to bring to you a dear colleague of several years and one who is a partner with Bread for the World from the Assembly of Canonical Orthodox Bishops, Father Nicholas Anton, who will greet us on behalf of the Assembly and will also offer an opening prayer. Father Nicholas, thank you for our partnership and thank you for greeting us and giving us the prayer at this time.
Thank you, Reverend Dr. Angelique. I just want to second everything that was just said. On behalf of the Assembly of Bishops, we're so honored to be hosting this event alongside Bread for the World. It's a wonderful partnership that we've had for many years now. And I want to thank our esteemed panelists for joining us today and bringing their expertise to the table so that we all might be edified and be able to do something about this critical crisis. Let us pray. Shine in our hearts, O God, who loves humankind, the pure light of your divine knowledge, and open the eyes of our minds, that we may comprehend the message of your gospel. Instill in us also reverence for your blessed commandments, so that putting down the desire of our bodies, we may lead a spiritual life, both thinking and doing all those things that are pleasing to you. For you are our sanctification and illumination, and we offer up glory to you, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, now and forever, and unto the ages of ages. Amen.
Father Anton, thank you so much for that beautiful blessing and that prayer for our time together. We now want to move along. We are trying to keep time today so that we are keeping with your expectations of your time schedule. We are now very blessed to have with us Miss Spyridoula Fotinis. She too is with the Assembly of the Canonical Bishops, the Canonical Orthodox Bishops, and she's going to tell us about the good news of a new Orthodox resource on homelessness, which is one of the catalysts for bringing us together today. So, Ms. Spyridoula, won't you give us a bit of an overview of the good news of this new resource?
Yes, thank you, Reverend Dr. Angelique and Father Nicholas for the opening prayer, and also excited to be here with all of you. And it's already been said, but I want to echo it again. Thank you again to Bread for the World for this opportunity to share this together and really uplift this resource. So I would like to provide now a little bit of an overview and brief history about why the guidebook was created and kind of the story behind it. So to begin, in September 2019, the Department of Inter-Orthodox, Ecumenical, and Interfaith Relations of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America invited Orthodox Christian ministries in the United States to a meeting focused on the issue of homelessness. So at the time, Father Nicholas and I were working for this department, and thus we were involved in this project, and also was involved with the Assembly of Canonical Orthodox Bishops as a ministry that is pan-Orthodox, meaning reaching out to all Orthodox jurisdictions across the United States. So why did we have this meeting? So the department was also involved at the United Nations, and as new members of the United Nations NGO Working Group to End Homelessness, we wanted to offer an Orthodox perspective in our global advocacy work, based on the work of the Orthodox Church worldwide. So to do this, we needed a common understanding. What are we working towards together? So the idea for this really came from colleagues from the FAMVIN Homeless Alliance, which is a ministry inspired by the work of St. Vincent and Paul, and they do incredible work worldwide to end homelessness. So to begin their ministry, they also started by gathering their different people together around the world and offering a space to really design a common understanding of what homelessness is. And that way they can actually solve it, right? You have to define something and then you can actually work towards ending it. So now going back to this meeting in September 2019, the idea was that we would also bring together Orthodox Christian organizations that work in some capacity and serve people who are at risk of experiencing or have exited homelessness. And so we brought together 10 different organizations in the United States at the time. And so over 2 days, these representatives engaged in intentional discussion on this topic and fashioned a common understanding of homelessness from an Orthodox Christian perspective. And so to continue the conversation and relationships that were created, a monthly network was established that continues to meet, which is now called the Orthodox Christian Ministries on Homelessness Network. And so out of this network, a tool wanted to be created for all Orthodox Christians and anyone that it could actually be used by. And the guidebook we are talking about today was created in collaboration with the network and with the blessing of the Assembly of Canonical Orthodox Bishops of the US. So this guidebook is a tool that is for parishes, or communities on the ground, in their local context to understand the complexities of homelessness and minister to the people in their communities who are experiencing homelessness in all its forms. And so this guidebook is a simple tool in understanding homelessness through Orthodox Christian theology and practice, an overview of homelessness. Obviously, it can be very multifaceted, so this is more of a simple approach in the guidebook. It also includes a self-assessment for parishes and accessible resources to build ministry and utilize resources that exist at the parish, such as excess church land and other things. So the guidebook is really trying to provide a groundwork for these first steps to be taken. And the vision is that at some point, there will be a series of robust resources in addition to this to really support parishes in their journey to alleviate and eventually end homelessness in their communities. So I would like to end by highlighting one part of the common understanding that we fashioned at this ministry's meeting in 2019. And so I quote, "In recognizing that we are broken and spiritually homeless in need of Christ, we also understand that beyond a physical shelter, each person requires to be served as a whole human being in need of a home, spiritually, mentally, physically, and emotionally with dignity and respect." And I think this is a good reminder, speaking from my own faith tradition, but that we are all spiritually homeless and on a journey to find our true home. And as we try to find our spiritual home, the basic need for a safe place to live cannot be overlooked in this world and on our journey. And I believe it is our duty as people to ensure that every person has their basic human right to a safe and affordable house fulfilled. And this house should then have the potential to become a home and a place that allows a person to grow and thrive in all aspects of life. And so with that, this resource, I hope, is really a stepping stone in doing this exact thing, is really making sure people have the right to place that is a house, to be a home, and really live these things out. So thank you very much for that brief introduction.
No, thank you very much for that overview. It's very helpful to our discussion as we move forward. Thank you. We now want to go into the heart of the discussion that, again, the resource helps to provide a catalyst for, and that is asking the question, what are the needs and what are the challenges of the peoples and the groups and communities who are affected by these issues of hunger and homelessness? Well, good news again. We have some experts who are here. You just heard one of them, and that's Miss Spyridoula. But now we're going to invite Dr. James Carras from Harvard University to offer some comments around this question. Miss Isabel Vandermolen from Bread for the World, one of our fellows here. He's working on issues around climate and the intersectional issues. And Miss Spyridoula Fotinis, we'll hear from her again. And then Mr. Charles Williams, who is our domestic policy analyst at Bread for the World. They will come in that order with a few moments to share what their insights might be around the needs and the challenges of the people and the communities. Dr. Carras, won't you begin the conversation? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you. I am going to share a PowerPoint just to be in the background. Unfortunately, when I hit this share button, it's not giving me, let's see, oh wait, here we go. Instead of taking the time to figure out the technology, I'm going to go proceed without a PowerPoint. I've spent 35 years teaching and presenting, and in only the last few years do we rely on PowerPoint. So I'll go back to the old school without it. So bear with me. So I want to give a little context about the issue of homelessness or being unhoused in America, and just look at some of the data points and statistics so we all have an understanding of it. The news, unfortunately, is not the good news that we're looking for. Unhoused in America, homelessness hit a record high in 2023 amid a widespread shortage of affordable housing and the end of pandemic relief programs. The U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, had their most recent point in time count of people experiencing homelessness, and it increased 12% from the previous year. Over 650,000, approaching 700,000 people are homeless in the United States. From the Metro Lab at Drexel University, some of the other key statistical points I'll share with you is that homelessness is tied to the fact of lack of a limited housing supply. And particularly, relative to affordability. During the past decade, there have been nearly 16 million households formed in the United States, yet only 12 million new homes were added to the market, suggesting a need for nearly 4 million new homes. So the supply of housing overall is limited and is being more challenged over the past a few years. But much of the housing that's been developed, this 12 million new homes that have been developed primarily for upper income households and upper income areas. I live in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. We've had a tremendous boom in our downtown, a redevelopment. We've added over 10,000 new rental residential units in our downtown. and at least 96, 97% of those units are for upper income households. They're upscale, if I can borrow that adjective, housing. Very reflective of the type of housing we're building. We're not building starter homes as we did post World War II. So the housing supply is primarily targeted to upper income housing. There's a, it actually this morning, God sent this to me this morning to share with you. The National Low Income Housing Coalition reported there's a shortage of 7.3 million affordable rental homes for the lowest income renters in our country, including those people that are on the verge of homelessness or are homeless. Last year, the gap was 7 million. So we've seen this gap increase by 300,000 over the past year for availability of rental homes for the lowest income. In that same report, it indicates no state in the United States has an adequate supply of affordable rental housing for the lowest income renters. And also, the report indicated that nearly 3/4 of renters with extremely low incomes are severely cost burdened. Being severely cost burdened in the United States means that you're spending more than 50% of your gross income on housing. So think about that. Think about how much you make every year, or how much your household makes every year in salary and earnings, and that you spent more than 50% of that on housing costs. That means you're severely cost burdened. 3/4 of those renters are extremely low income, those that are homeless or on the verge of homeless. And this is another indicator that has been on the rise. And finally, in the same report, in 12 of the 50 largest metropolitan areas in the country, the absolute shortage of affordable and available homes for extremely low income renters exceeds 100,000 units. When we talk about extremely low income, we're talking about people earning less than 30% of the area median income. Though that is what we classify as extremely low income. And a final data point, and I can go on, and I teach a course here at Harvard on housing policy, and we spend a semester digging into this. And I have a few minutes to share with you what I think some of the key data points are in terms of the context of being on housing in America. Another one that I found fascinating, in urban areas where we have census tracts where there are transit stations, they added about 2 million housing units in the last 20 years. That's great news, because if people are taking public transportation, their overall housing and transportation costs drop. But those without stations, census tracts without transit stations, added nearly 18 million units compared to the 2 million units. So too many housing units, new housing units, are added far from stations, increasing transportation costs for millions of Americans. So we continue development in suburban areas, single family housing with high transportation costs, and also very few rental units are being developed in these suburban communities, which are primarily not building single family starter homes as we did for our parents and grandparents post the Second World War, but in fact building housing for upper income households. So I'm sorry to share all of these upsetting and indicators in terms of where we are relative to housing supply, which is the key issue to me in terms of why people are housing. It's the fourth graders' answer to the question, why don't people, how do we deal with homelessness? Well, you get them a house. So when we talk about solutions, I'll talk about getting them a house. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much for that overview of what the challenges are, what the needs are. Ms. Isabella, perhaps you can help us further with some of the insight you have of what is causing some of these patterns of migrating and movement from place to place. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much again for having me on. And again, I'm the Climate Hunger Fellow at Bread for the World. And Yeah, so when I think about what are some of the challenges, is like one is the fact that climate change, and this increase in the frequency intensity of extreme weather events is going to multiply the risks that people face to become displaced or to become homeless. And then secondly, it also kind of multiplies the risks, the environmental risks and the safety risks, the health risks that people who are find themselves in homeless or displaced situations are um, subject to. So first is like the threat of displacement. Of course, James said, the infrastructure, like the availability of housing, the cost of housing is like one of the main causes, but also um, we're seeing that this access to like insurance and also the fact that homes that are, especially for like low income households, there are more people in low income households are more likely to live in older homes. And also those older homes are more likely to be in like high risk areas of natural disasters. And when we think about climate change maximizing the risk of like increased floods, of increased storms, of increased fires or heat waves, those people living in like low income households or low income communities, their houses are going to be the first ones to be affected. And then, of course, with the limited financial resources that a lot of people might have when they're, on the risk of becoming displaced or homeless, even if your home isn't completely obliterated, people don't always have access to insurance to be able to recover from when disasters affect their homes. And on top of that, insurance premiums are rising in a lot of places where extreme weather events are becoming like the normal and not an exception. There's like an analysis by the First Street Foundation that kind of goes in and sees that like 27% of properties in the lower 48 US states are at risk of their premiums spiking. So, again, this accessibility issue to being able to, know that you can depend on a secure, safe, reliable housing is becoming, it's just becoming not a reality anymore. And then when we think also internationally about like climate change or environmental issues, there's neighboring countries to the US, but also across the world where people in like rural areas or that rely on like land or small scale agriculture because of climate change having negative impacts on, again, maybe their infrastructure, but also their livelihoods, like their crops, if they rely on like small scale farming, repeated drought, storms, sea level rise make maybe their livelihoods or living where they are too dangerous, or their livelihoods unsubstantial to make ends meet. So there was a report done by like a bunch of US stakeholders called the Fifth National Climate Assessment that has kind of looked at territories in Central America's dry corridor that are experiencing a lot of livelihood loss. So they're forcing a lot of these people to move because, crops are continuously failing and they don't have the resources to keep going in their homes or the right to stay in their homes, which causes a lot of displacement. And I don't think, again, so basically, there's that threat of displacement that is increasing. And then when someone becomes homeless or becomes unable to access reliable shelter, heat is a huge issue. It's been an issue for a lot of people, but also when they're displaced or when they're on the move, they're just more susceptible to it. So in 2023, that was like the hottest official year on record. And in 2022 and in 2021, though, we have examples of like 300 homeless people dying just because of heat-related deaths in like places like Arizona. In 2022, I think it rose in like Phoenix metro area. And like more than half of these people that we know where they may have lived or where they may have not lived, like those people were homeless that were susceptible to heat induced deaths. So that's one thing. And again, it happens a lot in cities because people in urban settings are at a real disadvantage because urban cities, that black pavement, the concrete, the less access to like green spaces or water areas makes urban areas a lot hotter than in like suburban areas or places with more greenery. So that's another thing. And then lastly, just to connect it to food, there's some people that work in Houston called Search Homeless Houston that are seeing increases in even just like foodborne illnesses in homeless populations because, if you're homeless and you're able to procure food that you might want to save for later because you don't know maybe where your next meal is going to come from, that just increased heat, increased humidity, depending on where you live, it's going to spoil the foods that you're able to ration. And also then if you're trying to ration maybe like healthier foods or produce, you can't. You're going to have to ration things that are like heavily processed and are very low in nutrients. So those are kind of an overview of, you know, what climate change is going to do to amplify the risk of displacement and homelessness, but also some of the risks it brings to people that are in those situations already or start to become more in those situations.
Thank you so much, Ms. Isabella, and thank you for making it also domestic and global in your analysis. We do have those who are from outside of the U.S. who are a part of this webinar, and I'm sure they are very interested to make that comparison domestically as well as in our global context. We would like to now go to Ms. Spyridoula, who will also further the conversation with her remarks. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you both, James and Isabel. I think definitely building on what you were saying on this piece of the affordable housing being a key problem to not having housing to house people, and then also the displacement is environmental risk and disasters, I think are just scary, as we all know, and also further this issue. And fortunately, I'm going to add another element to it that I think also this is very US based right now, but also when people are forced out of their homes for various reasons, it's also this criminalization of homelessness. So if people are outside and then being actually forcefully removed, or in many other ways for their behaviors where they're trying to survive. So I really want to highlight this issue and then also kind of speak to the mind shift change that I think is necessary. So recently I read this article, human rights op-ed article published in Truth Out. It was written by Eleanor Goldfield, and she talked about her experience of being unhoused and how new criminalization laws are only dehumanizing people even more. And she shared some statistics in the report from the National Homeless Law Center that tracked criminalization laws from 2006 to 2019. So pre-pandemic, think there's probably a lot more post-pandemic. But they tracked this in 187 cities and found that citywide bans on camping have increased by 92%, on sitting or lying down by 78%, on loitering by 103%, on panhandling by 103%, and in living in vehicles by 213%. And at the same time, there was a 1,300% growth of homeless encampments reported in all 50 states. So this continues to obviously rise after the eviction moratoriums and all of these different things. And so just think about how when these laws then start to criminalize people trying to just live in the circumstances that they find themselves, then how we actually then make people way more or less human. And so I think this really shows that when we group people as numbers or as a problem, then it's easy to dehumanize and make someone subhuman, right? And so then it's easy to let these laws or situations that criminalize people that are just trying to survive to be okay. So I think we've seen this, there's like in our parks, maybe you see the dividers in the benches. And so people can't lie down there because then it's created purposefully to actually prevent people from being in our urban centers and kind of ruining the scene, right? But having this mindset, I think, then just allows for the further deterioration of seeing these people as human. And I think one of the key things that we as faith communities really can push is to try to change these narratives of people who experience homelessness or food insecurity or whatever it may be, that it's not individual failure. Unfortunately, we have that idea a lot in the United States still. So we think sometimes it's due to people's employment or mental illness or drug addiction. The list goes on, right? But at the same time, I think we know that there's actually a lot of structural and unexpected factors like being laid off of work, high medical bills, domestic violence, leaving foster care, tornadoes, which just happened recently in places like Ohio, Indiana, and continue to happen, right? That one day you have a home and the next you don't, to Isabel's point. And so all these different factors then are just one crisis away from being left outside. And so the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness also confirms this and shows in the recent statistics and supports that more than half of Americans live paycheck to paycheck, right? And we're one crisis away from being left on the street or being left without a home. So that's more than half of the US population. And if something happened to us and we were forced out of our homes, how do we want to be treated? Do we want to be treated as subhuman and a criminal? I think this is really against our Christian understanding of humanity and the human person, right? And so I think one of the challenges in our communities is trying to change this idea, and first to make sure people are recognized for their humanity by us, the people working with them, and by the law, and continuing to do that advocacy work, which I'm grateful to Brett for doing a lot of advocacy and policy work, right? And so then with this too, it's also how can we provide safe and affordable housing, as James was talking about, how can we actually make this a little bit easier for people to find housing? And if people are exiting homelessness, let's say for substance use or whatever it may be, I'm a huge proponent of housing first and the principles that I believe James will get to, and really allowing this harm reduction approach where you're giving people housing first and then allowing them the space to figure everything else out. Because having a safe place to live is the most fundamental point to figure out everything else in your life. And in the meantime, while we do this work, the challenge of just offering basic resources, such as protection from the heat, to Isabel's point, or food, or hygiene amenities and shelter that is safe, is really important. I think faith communities are really good at doing this and do it very well already. And obviously we can always do more. So those are some of the things I want to share to add to the challenges that we face as communities.
Well, thank you so much, Ms. Spyridoula, for helping to make those connections with all of what has been said thus far, and then pushing the discussion further of the other interrelated issues that come into the conversation. It is now my joy also now to bring Mr. Charles Williams, who also is with Bread for the World, our domestic policy analyst. And you are welcome, sir, to further the discussion from your lens. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for having me here, and for the rest of the panel for giving such amazing insight. My name is Charles Williams. I am the Senior Domestic Policy Analyst for Bread for the World. In my role with Bread, I handle domestic hunger policies, and I've had the opportunity to see the issue of hunger and homelessness from a bird's eye view. But personally, I was able to see and feel the effects of hunger and the threat of not having a place to live right at home as a young man. Um these issues between hunger and homelessness are inextricably related. I was born in East North Carolina in a small town surrounded by farmland and a lot of food. But that food never made it to us consistently because we were poor. There were occasions where my dad and my mom couldn't make ends meet and had to make the unfortunate choice that so many other folks have to make. Do I pay rent to keep the roof over their heads? I had a brother and a sister of my children. Or do I buy food? A tragic choice to make. No one should ever have to make that choice. Yet, many people are forced to make the same choices day after day or month after month, and are essentially living on the edge, forced to choose between basic necessities like purchasing food, paying rent, or going to the doctor. And the data paints a stark picture. Over 40 million people lived in food insecure households last year. Over 11 million adults lived in households with very low food security. Over 7 million children lived in food insecure households in which children, along with adults, were food insecure. Over 700,000 children, that's 1.1% of our nation's children, live in households in which one or more child experienced very low food security. The relationship between food, economic security, and public health, that's another piece, right? The nutritional piece. It's hard to overstate. When food prices change, consumers notice. When restaurant or farm-based employment plummets, the economy suffers. When income drops, food insecurity rate rises, affecting both health and nutrition. All interrelated, all tied in with one another. Nutritional concerns are not only a problem in economic downturns either. Even before the pandemic, more than 1/10 of all US households and 8.3% of households with elderly individuals face food insecurity. Accessibility is the issue. Accessibility to food, accessibility to jobs, accessibility to housing, accessibility to healthcare. All these make up the collective issue, and we have a ton of work to do to build a strong pipeline where services for the most vulnerable are accessible. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Mr. Charles, for that very helpful insight about, again, the linkages between the two issues, and also being generous to share your own story in this space, because we know ultimately the statistics and the data absolutely matter in terms of being able to drill down to some of the root causes, but we also know it's also the lived out stories that compel us to do the work. So thank you for that as well. Well, we've talked a bit about the challenges, we've talked about the needs of the people, the needs of the community in a kind of broad way, but we've also had some narrowing down. But now we want to move to what are the faith responses? That is the title of our theme. What are the responses and the call to action? What are we to do about this? What should be our responsibility, especially as people of faith? We're going to begin with Ms. Spyridoula, who will come back with some concrete recommendations. And of course, we already know what one of them is. That is, get that resource, get the resource. And I believe we can put that in the chat so that you can get it because it is online, but I'm sure she has more she wants to share. And then, of course, we'll come back to Mr. Charles Williams and Miss Isabel and also Dr. James, who will come and give us some ways forward. So, Ms. Spyridoula, won't you begin? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Charles. I think building what you were saying, I really like this pipeline idea of creating this accessibility for food, job, income, housing, healthcare, everything you said. And thank you for lifting it up and your personal experiences, Reverend Dr. Angelique already said. And so really building on that, I think for me, one of the calls to action is, as people of faith, is being empowered to really live the Christian faith in action, right? Using the resources we have to serve and learning to serve people as true human beings. Again, grounded in this Christian anthropology. So this really means being radical and living the gospel, right? This means serving our neighbors as Christ, as equal and worthy human beings. It means removing our stereotypes and fears that let us stay in our isolated communities. It means being trained to work with people that have been living outside or people who have lack of access to resources and understanding how to connect them to resources, and being also understanding of what it means when you're trying to survive outside, that you then really are faced with different things that cause mental health and mental illness, physical health issues and complexities. And so that doesn't come and is not the reason people are outside, and that should not define how we see people. Instead, it's learning how to be equipped to serve based on the needs of the person in front of us and understand and respond as fully as possible as we can. So how do we do this in practice? And this is one of the reasons why we're here trying to uplift this resource. And first, I think education is really vital. Everything we talked about today, I know I learned a lot and continue to learn a lot. And I think just generally, it is our duty as people to be aware of and understand the needs of the people that are unhoused or homeless or food insecure or displaced in our local communities, those who are hidden homeless or are hiding their inaccessibility to food or income or whatever it may be, because there's also stigma surrounding it, and trying to break that down and understanding the laws that are being proposed at a state and local and national levels that may criminalize people that are in these situations or make it really difficult to access resources when needed. So then knowing all these things, then being equipped to respond materially and with advocacy as needed, I think is really important. And so for us in our faith communities and our parish communities, we created this guidebook for Orthodox parishes, again, as the first step or as a tool to try to empower people to begin this process on their own in their local community, right? So our local context is so important because we are here, to Reverend Dr. Angelique's point earlier. And so this guidebook, again, is trying to, one, provide understanding of homelessness and the risk of becoming homeless better. It also provides tools to assess the local needs of the community and connect to organizations that are already doing work on the ground, and then trying to grow ministry to fill the gaps of things that are not being taken care of. And especially to see what resources the church offer and how to find ways to share them with the local communities to alleviate these different issues and different things that are happening, because we have a lot to share. And I think it's important. Speaking for my own parish, we have huge halls and we could definitely house people there or provide shelter, right? So bringing in the conversation of educating what is happening in the community, why are we afraid, and trying to break down that fear, and then understanding what do we have to give and how can we give it. And there are people that are trained in our communities that do this. So really it's just a matter of being in in partnership and understanding what local leaders are doing to really bring this forward. So again, this guidebook is really a tool to begin this process. And it's also in conversations like the ones we were having today, where we learn from each other and then grow these partnerships to do the work we need to do in our local communities to alleviate either homelessness or hunger, or be ready to prevent natural disasters, or whatever it may be, because there's a lot of things in this world we are trying to make a little bit better. I will leave that there, and I will drop the guidebook into the chat, as Reverend and Angelique said as well.
Thank you so much. And again, I know all the different speakers have said it one way or another, but so often we don't get things done because we don't have the will. It's really, the blindedness of
Yep.
stigma and fear
Yep.
that prevent us a lot of times of being able to go to the next steps of taking the action. So again, thank you for re-emphasizing that, making available. I see it's in the chat now. Want to encourage everyone to get this resource as a tool that can help us going forward as well. But without further ado, it's my joy to bring back Mr. Charles to further the conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Angelique. No, thank you, Spyridoula. You touched on the responsibility of the church, and historically, the church has stood at the very forefront of giving freely to the underserved, the poor, the most vulnerable. The legacy of the church as leaders in feeding the hungry and destitute is undeniable. But today, as food insecurity and hunger remains problematic, church and faith leaders are facing big challenges, but also an opportunity to take up these issues in an impactful way. I spent 9 years working on Capitol Hill with lawmakers from all walks of life and their staffers. And when the church comes and knock on congressional doors, they open up and they listen. And so my call today is for the church community, its allies, its partners, its stakeholders. It's to mobilize, mobilize, mobilize. There are several issues that the church can advocate for on the local level, state levels, and the federal levels. And I have a few examples here. Outside of the wonderful toolkit that was dropped in the chat, the church and the community can work with your elected leaders on financing initiatives to incentivize building supermarkets or local grocery stores to alleviate food deserts, areas that are underserved as it pertains to getting food to the tables of people who need it most. Um, Partnering with schools, community colleges, hotels, other food related businesses that can act as community food kitchens to provide storage and distribution capacities in communities that lack infrastructure. The church can work with federal food programs and farmers to provide fresh veggies and fruits to individuals in food deserts, for example. Advocate for universal free school meal programs so that all school age children have access to food. But most importantly, your church and the church community would do the most good serving as a beacon of hope for individuals when they're in dire need, whether that means serving the homeless after service or before service, and giving hot foods to the hungry and underserved in other ways, or creating food pantries. We must be aggressive in our desire to fill empty stomachs and to get housing who need it most. Isabel?
May I just pick up on something you said very importantly as well, Brother Charles, being a beacon of hope. And people experience a beacon of hope when we act. And that's what I love about where we are in this discussion, being the beacon of hope by the actions we are outlining now. Thank you so much again. I'm sorry, Mrs. Bella. Please go ahead.
No, yeah, thank you. I think honestly, I agree with everything that Spyridoula and Charles had to say, and I really liked Spyridoula's idea that we have to be really careful about what public opinion is of people that are experiencing homelessness or displacement. And I think like part of me would say that even like holding our community, like our faith community accountable, on like, how do we think about them? How do we speak about them? And how do we let people that represent us or the people that we, people in power, like speak about them as well? It's like, it says a lot about who we are and who, the faith community has a lot of power to be able to change public opinion. So I think that's really important. And just also, I'd say that pursuing and like not being shy about minding like public policies and programs that alleviate hunger and that can alleviate homelessness or can make um, even just the physical area more like homeless friendly, I guess, or displacement friendly. Like Spyridoula was saying, there's like seating. If you look at like weird benches in cities, and like, oh, why is that like that? It's because they don't. It's to kind of deter people that are displaced from being able to comfortably find rest or find a place of rest. So I'd say that like in a climate space, especially being careful about or kind of trying to support development and planning that would help kind of greenify or make sure that urban heat areas especially aren't as hot. I feel like caring for creation kind of all comes down to like, you can't just care for one part of creation and then not care for another part of creation. And the beautiful part about caring for creation and caring for the climate and environment and people is that you can do it all together. So, by maybe encouraging your city or community or even like in your local church or parish to like plant more trees or have more green spaces, that can significantly reduce how hot certain urban areas are. There's this city in Colombia, Medellin, that has like done an initiative where they have like planted a bunch of trees within their urban centers and are significantly reducing just like the heat pressure that people have to live with there. So I think that's really important. And also, like Spyridoula said, education, letting first, like, arming yourself with, like, what are the environmental and health risks in this particular community or in my particular region that are emerging, especially because, like, stuff with the climate crisis is emerging. The amount of heat that people are subject to is emerging. And it's also being specific. It's not just heat in some places. I'm from Michigan. Or if someone's like from Philadelphia, and it's like, well, it's not really heat that I think people are dealing with because winters are getting shorter. It's getting warmer, and that's a good thing. Even just like someone getting doused in rain and being wet for like a day can like really increase their chance of like hypothermia and other health risks. So getting to know what the real risks are, in a climate context, in an environmental context, and then also being able to hold your community accountable, hold whether that's again the secular or our faith communities accountable for pursuing policies and changes that are like loving and specific, I think is super important.
Well, thank you so much, Mrs. Bella, to remind us to be proactive. I really appreciate that. When we're thinking about, the new housing that's needed, the food that is needed, what can we do to be active and to be proactive around sustainable life? Sustainable life means we have to take seriously the issues around climate, for example. So thank you, especially for reminding us all your remarks, of course, but being proactive matters. Dr. James, won't you come? Thank you. Are you there? I believe you're muted.
Sorry, I have to reload Teams and my mic was off. I was saying, Reverend, that this has been incredibly enlightening to me in terms of my perspectives, in terms of housing development in particular. And I appreciate the remarks, particularly Isabel's remarks just now on sustainability, but also your remarks in Spyridoula talking about the need for will, to have will. And I would add that to kind of from a public perspective, political will, and also Charles's personal narrative. In thinking and reflecting on all of those comments that were just made, without getting into a deep personal history, I grew up in a public housing project in Roxbury in Boston, And my father died 3 months before I was born. My mother was an immigrant. I was the youngest of 4 children. And I said recently to my oldest brother, who was a Greek Orthodox priest, I said, you know, if it wasn't for the government, for our political policy of creating public housing, we probably would have been homeless. When Dad died and Mom just had 4 children and, you know, was living on public benefits. And he turned to me and he said, no, it was not so much the public housing. It was the fact that we lived next door to the church and our faith brought us together, and her faith that lifted us up. And I think we both, after discussion, could agree that it was both faith and policy that lifted up our family. So, Charles, thank you for reminding us of our own personal narratives. And so, based on that, duality of policy and faith, I would call us that we both, in a public sector and from a faith-based perspective, must have the will, and our faith-based leaders, both lay and clergy, must have the will to lead us and to call these issues out and to come up with our own plans for sustainability, Isabel. And I think about my own church at home, about we have property, and what are we doing with it, and what we can do with it is more the issue, and we need to be inspired to do that and come up with a plan. But from a policy perspective, in addressing homelessness, I think that we, from the United States perspective, and also from an international perspective, and Spyridoula's just spent 2 years studying from an international perspective on how to address homelessness. I think most of us agree that the housing first model is the most important approach. And housing first is essentially a model of relying that get people into housing first, provide them with one of the basic necessities of life, which is shelter, then deal with the other issues in terms of getting them a job, addressing addiction issues and mental and physical health issues. But the number one thing is providing housing and shelter. That begs the policy issue of, well, Carras just finished telling us how the shortage of housing that we have in this country. Therefore, we must produce housing. Then we can turn to our churches and our faith-based institutions in our community and say, you have one of the most valuable assets in terms of the production of housing, which is land. Think about what you're doing with the property that you own, both from a sustainability perspective, but from a shelter perspective as well. Can you, and I would love to have some GIS modeling of our communities and say, how much land do we own, whether they're Orthodox churches or Protestant or Catholic or Jewish temples and Muslim mosques, how much land do we own? It would be absolutely amazing to see the inventory of land that is owned and how much is used simply for parking. I know in Florida, the Floridians, they don't go anyplace unless there's a parking space right on front. And we do that with our churches and our as well. Oh no, don't move me away from my parking. I need to be close to the front door. I'm sorry for being facetious that way, but land is an incredible asset for the development of housing. If you can take 20% of the cost out of the production of housing because land is made available, now we're contributing to affordability. If we contribute to the supply of affordable housing, now we'll be able to fulfill the promise of housing first. So, in wrap up, our political level, each community must have a comprehensive housing approach that includes addressing low-income housing and housing for those who are on the verge of homelessness and for those that are unhoused. All too often, our public sector leaders are looking to address issues around workforce housing, which is more politically palatable because often the imagery of those extremely low income, and it ties into racial equity issues, that our images of affordable housing are for those people, and I'll be very blunt, and those people are often minorities, people of color, and that leads to issues of the lack of political will to address affordable housing for extremely low income. But on the faith-based side, and I think the guidebook that Spyridoula has guided through for the last 4 years and making that a reality is important to get each parish to think about individually what they're doing and what they're contributing. Again, thank you to all for what I've learned here today and for the time to reflect and to think about some of the solutions and moving forward. Reverend?
Thank you so much, Dr. James. That was really helpful in terms of just kind of bringing some of the pieces together in terms of how it is we understand both the needs and the responses that we are called to do in this moment. Really want to appreciate that. And also the comment about furthering this idea of sustainability around how do we do urban planning? What does that look like going forward, given the issues that Ms. Isabella has raised in her remarks, as well as other remarks concerning climate, but concerning the people's needs. It all goes together, and having the will, and certainly we have the commission from the Great Commission, from Jesus himself, telling us that we're to love God, neighbor, and self. Well, moving right along, it is time for our guests to offer any questions or clarifications they may like to share. We do have time, I'm happy to say, to do that. Is there anyone who would like to ask a question or offer a comment to continue with the conversation? Do you see any hands, Father Nick?
I don't. I think that it has to happen through there's like a question and answer feature or the chat. So
Uh-huh.
I think they'll come in if you have a question or you have something to say. You can either ask that question in the chat box or through the question and answer feature, and then the panelists will be able to see that and answer.
Yeah. Thank you for those instructions. And what I would like to say is thank you for those who took the time to write in the chat who you are. You are welcome to do so. We had invited that earlier in the chat, and some of you have responded. We're glad to have both domestic and global leaders in the space. But if you have questions going forward, please, this is the time we'll stop and you can continue with your questions or clarifications. But in the meantime, I would like to further the conversation with our presenters until we see where there may be questions. Friends, as we think about the wheel, and we think about the commissioning with scripture and with the history that we all know, so many seem to sometimes lack the value, the values of being able to say, I need to be engaged. What more can we do to help people to have the will to not only appreciate what has been presented as an educative way, but to act out their faith, to overcome the fears, overcome the stigmas? What other advice might you offer to help people who we all know who are in that kind of disposition that might be overcome? Would anyone like to share further on that point? And I did see a comment from one of our guests saying this has all been great. We're kindly accept your encouragement on that. Thank you so much. Any further thoughts from our presenters? Mhm.
I could say something unless somebody else wants to go first. You just, as you were talking about this will to act, it made me think a couple of things. First, thinking, one, I hear a lot of narratives as a young person in the church that a lot of people my age are not involved in church communities because, at least in my communities, not seeing how the church is acting in the world and really social issues that are important to us, right? And so for me, actually, one of the goals of being involved in working for the church is actually creating these opportunities and showing that the church is active. But a key example I was thinking when you were saying this was this great ministry we have in the Orthodox Church. It's run under Focus North America, which is the Fellowship of Orthodox Christians United to Serve. And they specifically have a youth project called Youth Equipped to Serve. Yes. And what they do, and the person that runs it is incredible, and really grounds it in understanding the person that we're trying to serve as an equal human being, right? And I remember being in the trainings and being encouraged that we need to, if somebody is let's say on the street, on the ground, we don't talk to them looking down, right? We come at the same level, eye to eye, and we really recognize who they are as a person, no matter what they're going through, no matter if they're angry at us or there's a mental illness or kind of trauma that comes out on us. Like, one, we don't take that personally. Instead, we say, okay, this is a person in front of me that I'm called to serve in this moment and just be present with. And understanding, I think, that deep humanity of the other person really helps to undo these stigmas and stereotypes. And this program also really encouraged young people in our churches to break down the service project mentality. And instead, this idea, I think you can see it through my remarks earlier, this idea of like, if we are actually trying to live our Christian faith, then we are called to serve as radically as Christ did in his time, right? And so being that person, I think, is one of the first steps, again, with everything we talked about, one, being educated, but then like really digging into who am I and who is the human being in front of me and how can I really be present. And also, one, uplift their suffering, even if I don't understand it, but just really be real and understand in that moment, this is where we are, this is what's happening, what do I have to offer? Maybe it's just a prayer sometimes it's hard, you don't have anything else, but what else? Now, based on that, I think the next step is then learning what we do have in our communities and being able to give it. Those are my initial thoughts, but happy to let somebody else have some space too to grow on that as well.
Well, thank you. That really begins to address this question further. Are there any other thoughts that would like to be offered? And then we do have a response in the chat from one of our guests. But quickly, would anyone else like to add to what she has shared? No? Yes?
I feel like
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. No, yeah,
Go
I just feel like
ahead.
real quick, one of the other things that I feel like sometimes people can think about when they're thinking about, aid to people that are displaced or experiencing homelessness or experiencing hunger is this idea like, oh, we're doing people favors, or the government is doing people favors by giving them like a mass shelter where like 20 people stay, or we're doing people a favor by giving them like leftover food or food that's like high in calories but not necessarily nutrient dense. And I feel like as people of faith we can really kind of like think about that and grasp it and realize, oh, this isn't about doing people favors, this is about, like Spyridoula was saying, doing justice and giving people like truly what they deserve, which isn't just the bare minimum but things that will actually make them feel dignified and like they can flourish and like they can see the brightness in the world and see fully realize themselves. And that is, like Spyridoula and Dr. James was saying, like real houses, like real houses, real places for them to have their own little dominion, and also real food from a bread context, food that's going to nourish them, that they can relate to. But anyway, that's just one of the things that I feel like, again, as a faith community, we can maybe understand more than this idea that the government or aid groups do people favors by giving them somewhat the bare minimum for free.
I want to thank you for bringing that point, because it's really not about us being able to, if you will, deliver as much as it is being in solidarity and community with people. In other words, again, getting rid of this whole issue of being stereotypical, if I can put it in those terms, but really coming alongside. That's what's so beautiful about the story of Jesus. Jesus was always just trying to come alongside people, right? The children, the women, those who were afflicted with various diseases. He was not ever trying to condemn or look down upon them. He was just coming alongside. And I think, Miss Isabella, that's what you're kind of pointing to. Jesus really is the Savior. We're not the saviors. We are only stewards of what God has given us. We're only stewards. So how do we do that with humility? How do we do that with sincerity and love and with openness? And I think that's what's so beautiful about the gospel message, that's about love. It's not about doing a favor to anyone, but doing your part to be in solidarity with all of God's people. And certainly Jesus is our example of that. But let me just go over here. I think it's Miss Evangelos Tiani. I don't know if I'm saying that quite right. I don't know if you would like to speak, or would you like me to just share from the chat as I can interpret it by the reading. You are free to speak, to share what you have put in the chat. Would you like to do so? I'm not hearing a response, so I'll just read what's in the chat. In Africa, we also have homelessness due to the loss of community and external family lands. Therefore, many end up losing their lands because they have sold their personal piece or home when community land is subdivided to get money for their survival. Is that something that happens in the US? Who would like to respond to the question of our guests? Yes, Dr. James, I see your square may be lit.
And I think about, I don't know if it happens in the U.S. in the sense of people selling land just to meet basic needs. I'm pretty sure that does happen. I mean, people are economically challenged in the U.S. as they are in other parts of the country and other parts of the world. But I do think of issues, particularly with African American families that have had properties passed from generation to generation and wind up selling because their neighborhoods, their communities are being gentrified, and investors come in and are offering, to buy homes. And because families are in need, whether it's for basic, survival needs, or even just beyond that, in terms of providing education to their children or starting a business, homes are being sold, and that connection to community is being lost. I don't have any statistics, but I certainly think it is a phenomenon that we see happening in the United States. Increasingly, private equity and private investors are buying single family homes, particularly in lower opportunity, underserved areas, because that's where the least expensive housing is. And they're buying that housing and converting it to rental housing. So it is an issue here in the U.S. as well.
Thank you, Dr. James. I think Mr. Charles, you were saying something in the chat as well as a response. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to piggyback off of Mr. Carras's comments. Yes, it certainly happens. I can only speak to my experience in the U.S. South, where folks keep homes for generations after generation, and usually when it gets to a point where the price of maintaining that home or maintaining that farm or maintaining that land, if it gets to a point where it's unsustainable for folks, they sell it, right? Or developers will come in and they'll buy it, or sometimes it's businesses that can strong arm communities out of certain plots of land in certain spaces in the U.S. So what I answer within the chat was yes, this does happen, but in a different context and to a different degree.
I want to thank you both for speaking to the issue of what's happening in our urban sectors. We know that very much in this moment, that particularly communities of people of African descent and also even our Latina and poor white communities are affected by the moments of what is called gentrification in our urban sectors is very much alive. And many people have been, as they might put it, been moved or pushed out to sell their land and to sell their properties, homes that have been there for many, many years, in order to accommodate the business community that has come in and put pressure, oftentimes pressure for them to move to other places. So that is very much an issue in this moment. When I think about the issues around people of African descent moving during the Great Migration, over 6 to 7 million from 1900 to about 1959, thereabout, who came from the South to move from some of the terror and the hardships of being on the land, but not owning the land or having owned parcels of the land, and by eminent domain, by policies, push them out, or taxation that they could not afford because monies were not available, even if you own land. So many people of African descent, it's the largest migratory patterns in the United States, came north to find economic opportunity for money, to be able to have currency, for their work, and not just very minimal means of room and shelter. These are historic issues within the U.S. context, and we still find where some of those same patterns are being affected in our urban communities, and even with Black farmers who we work with at Bread for the World, where this is part of the narrative. And so I think that there are different international presentations of the issue, but the issues are still the same, nevertheless, which is why I'm so glad that we have experts dealing with both the domestic and the global spaces, and why this issue of being homeless or unhoused, or if you will, no room for people to live, is such a critical issue in this moment. So thank you very much for that question and observation. I do hope that there's been a response that can be a blessing to you. Are there others who would like to share in this moment from our presenters or from those who are our guests today? Anyone else? Okay, oh, go ahead,
Oh.
please. You're
No,
welcome.
I was just no. Actually, I was just gonna kind of agree with you, Angelique. But I feel like one of the things I see there's like a thing in the chat about, you know, I think an issue with we're seeing the faith life or faith community in the U.S. is there's these talks about faith communities kind of becoming smaller actually. And I think about like capacity issues especially. So I think what Evangelos Piani was saying, I think that would be the ideal, what their comment is, to be able to, have almost all churches be able to like open some kind of like housing establishment or compound and be able to really care for people who are displaced or are in need in general. But I guess in a US context, just remembering where we are and kind of understanding again, that there's sometimes limited church capacities, but being creative, always helps. And I think with the paper, the report that's come out, I mean, I think that the litmus test and everything kind of will help every parish and every church realize, how exactly they can play a part in, hopefully helping people that are displaced or homeless or hungry.
Well, thank you so much, Ms. Isabel, for pointing that out in the chat. Certainly, I had overlooked that. Thank you so much. I was actually a part of a movement years ago as a younger woman, whereby that actually took place, where people were brought into the churches to find a home for temporary. It was temporary, but it played its role. And the churches opened their doors for people to come and overnight during whatever the critical moment may have been in their lives. I don't know if that still goes on in the ways it did when I was coming along in the younger years of my ministry, but it was a powerful movement. And another movement I think about was what was called the sanctuary movement. The sanctuary movement that literally the churches, now this was really had to do with policy as well as the urgencies of the moment, where churches stood in the gap between those who said it was unlawful to have those who had come for shelter and for food from the south of the borders came and stayed in their churches. And they provided shelter. They provided shelter from literally the arrest and deportation of those who had come across the border and stood in the gap. I was a part of those movements too. Some of my history's coming up here, but where they stood literally in the gap, and the law enforcement did not come in ways that they did in some other places. But I can remember standing in solidarity with some of our brothers and sisters who needed that help and that support. They were provided food and shelter. I don't know that the sanctuary movement gets the attention that it did once, but it's certainly part of the history in this part of the country. I do see another comment in the chat. Thank you. U.S. Senator Sherrod Brown introduced a bill recently that would provide grants to churches that work to provide housing for communities. Thank you, Charles. You want to say something more about that, Mr.
Yeah,
Charles?
it's called the Yes in God's Backyard Act. So it does just what it says inside the chat. I learned about it last week as I was chatting with an old colleague, and it's a big deal. As Mr. Carras mentioned earlier in this conversation, the church has a ton of land. It's a great opportunity, right, to connect folks in the faith community directly with the housing that we're talking about today. I just felt like it was timely to mention it, and it looks like a bill with the faithful spirit behind it. So yes, there are folks who are thinking about these things, which is, thank God we're thinking about these things, and I think we should continue to encourage them to think about it more often.
Well, thank you so much. And of course, we're always looking for resources. I mean, that's part of the reason why we're here today is to uplift these tools that can help the community of faith do its work. Well, friends, I don't see anything more in the chat unless I missed it. And I know Mrs. Bella, she's got me. If you see anything more in the chat, let me know. But in this moment, since we're getting close to the top of the hour, and we promised to let you go at the top of the hour, I'm wanting to invite our presenters to please offer any concluding remarks that you might like to make about what we've heard today or anything you want to further recommend. I just feel this has been such a helpful conversation for all of us. I am certainly grateful. And thank you, Father Anton, for allowing this moment to be
Thank you, Father.
presented. So, who would like to begin with a wrap up comment? Keeping in mind we're down to 8 minutes and we still have a closing prayer because we want to be blessed on the way back to the journey. Who would like to do so? All right, I'm going to call a name. All right. Dr. James, you're on. Dr. James, Ms. Spyridoula, Charles, Mr. Chance, and then
I can do it.
you
I'll
can
do it.
do it. Okay, you're
Yeah,
gonna step in.
you call my name, so I have to now.
Okay, go
Um,
on.
I think I just want to end with a quote. I'll wrap up my remarks with a quote. Um, a quote from Bread for the World's former president, David Beckman, comes to mind as I reflect on these issues. He said, "This great liberation has spiritual, ethical, and political implications. The escape of hundreds of millions of people from hunger and poverty is an experience of God's love in our time, like the biblical Exodus. As we pray for our daily bread, we are now invited and required to pray for the end of hunger. God calls us not only to share our bread, but also to push for political commitment to the legal and structural changes needed to end hunger." And I want to add to that to provide housing for the most vulnerable as well. So that's how I'll wrap it up.
We love that quote. Thank you. Who wants to follow that? Good luck with that.
Stop.
Yeah, amen, Reverend. Not easy to follow. But I will provide a footnote, if you will, if not a follow up. And the footnote is on what was mentioned earlier about Senator Brown's bill, whether that gets passed or not in this contentious political environment that we're in. I mean, I certainly hope. But we need all of us in the faith-based community to think about the resources that our churches and our parishes need to participate in providing housing. Those needs specifically, we need to think about additional capital and grants that may be available to them and helping them access to them. We need to be able to provide them with training opportunities and educational opportunities so they understand the process and the linkage of housing first and how they can play a role in terms of the production of housing, because supply is the bottom line issue to housing, to homelessness. We need to provide them with technical assistance and handholding in terms of going through that process. But we also need to recognize those churches and faith-based institutions that have done this and that they can share their knowledge and transfer their knowledge to others in a peer-to-peer learning environment. And finally, is to create a pool of experts, if you will, who are willing to offer their time and their talent to faith-based institutions in thinking about addressing homelessness and developing housing in their community. So I think on our kind of a larger scale, I pray and hope that we get to a better place in terms of offering resources to those that are in the communities that are want to act but don't know how and don't have the resources to do so.
Thank you so much for that. And also here we were reminded of the resource that our Orthodox brothers and sisters have produced. That's also a toolkit in that regard as well. Thank you so much. All right, ladies, it's on you.
I'll go and let Spyridoula finish. I have the last word. I think just I'm going to reiterate what I said earlier, but I feel like, again, coming from the climate, hunger, people, of course, perspective is just that caring for creation means caring for all of creation and the beautiful part of that. And I feel like, again, faith communities kind of start to learn this and know this. It's backed by science and it'll be backed by policy when we start advocating and doing it. Is that caring for all of creation together, it just helps each other. It's there, we have a symbiotic relationship with the environment around us. And I think we should be called to continue to care, as we care for people, we'll care for the environment and vice versa. And I think that's really great. So yeah, Spyridoula, to you.
Yeah, thanks. Definitely don't want the last word, but I think amen, as was said earlier, really fits. And I think what everybody has said, I think we really cut out the work we have in front of us here from everything we talked about. And again, just really resonated with everyone. And especially, as James was saying, these resources, training, and all these different things we can really scaffold to really make this happen. So I would say the last thing is, like, let's go out and do this in our communities. I think we have a lot of things here that we talked about, and now it's how we actually engage with our fellow colleagues and faith communities to do this work. So let's do it. Let's go out.
Thank you all. I'd like to give a hand for everyone for all that you have contributed, our guests, our presenters. Thank you so much. And now we'll close with a blessing back to Father Anton with his closing remarks. And thank you again, everyone, for all that has been said and done. And I know we'll want to share this widely, what has been discussed this day. Over to you, Father. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Reverend Dr. Angelique. Lord, now let your servants depart in peace according to your word. For your eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared in the presence of all people, a light for revelation to the Gentiles and for the glory to your people Israel. Amen. Thank you all.
Amen. God bless everyone. Have a beautiful day.